All right, we got a few minutes here. We'll try and get back on schedule. But we'll have Catherine Schake from the Homer Soil and Water Conservation District give a presentation on tackling the invasive chokecherry tree on the Kenai Peninsula. And we'll start that in about 5 minutes. All right. Catherine Shakey. I got a correction on your name.
Yeah.
Catherine's the Invasive Species Program Director at the Homer Soil and Water Conservation District. And she's going to talk to us about tackling the chokecherry, the invasive chokecherry on the Kenai Peninsula. I'll turn it over to you, Catherine.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about our project here on the peninsula the last few years. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's nice to have this option. As mentioned, one of my main roles is to coordinate the Kenai Peninsula Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. And we are basically the 6 million acre landmass of the Kenai Peninsula is our geographic scope. So I'll just provide a brief overview of the SISMA and then launch into the chokecherry program. So there is a SISMA for the Anchorage area as well, and we work closely with them. But basically, we monitor the roadways, access points, and perimeter of these 3 major federal landowners on the peninsula. So we have the Chugach National Forest in dark green, we have the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in blue, and Kenai Fjords National Park in bright green. And then the orange is the Kenai Soil and Water Conservation District, and the yellow is the Homer Soil and Water Conservation District. And conservation districts don't own land, but we do support private and smaller scale public landowners in implementing natural resource conservation projects. So the main role of the SISMA is to focus on invasive species management at a regional landscape level scale, because we know invasive species do not care about jurisdictional boundaries. And we do that largely with federal funding. And we have been around for 20 years now, actually. Originally in 2003, we were started as a cooperative weed management area. So we mostly focus on plants. But a couple of years ago, we changed our name to the Invasive Species Management Area so that we can expand our work to include other taxa. And so far, what that means is just supporting outreach and education for marine and freshwater invasive species. We have a lot of very active partners and passionate individuals in the SISMA. We have state and federal agencies, nonprofits, tribal entities, and local governments all involved. And we're a pretty high functioning group for an informal partnership. It's a pretty fun part of my job to interact with all these folks. And we're doing what we do so that we can protect the natural resources, wildlife, fish, and the livelihoods that we all depend upon here in Alaska. The primary goals of the SISMA are to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species, reduce the extent and density of newly established infestations, implement the most economic, effective, and safe control methods. So we're very careful about when and where we consider using herbicide, and facilitate cooperation among those working together. So we share resources, expertise, knowledge, staff, boats, herbicide. We share a lot of things, and it helps us be successful at that regional scale. Just so we're all on the same page, an invasive species is one that is not native to an ecosystem and whose introduction can cause harm to the environment, the economy, or to human health. So what does that mean? What's the problem with invasive plants? Well, they reduce the ecological, agricultural, and economic value of the land. So we see things like reed canary grass changing hydrology that our salmon depend upon. We see water chemistry being altered. We see native plants being outcompeted, and basically the building blocks of our ecosystems shifting when an invasive species comes in and creates a monoculture. So, and we know more and more as climate change impacts continue to increase, and that the key to maintaining resilient, sustainable habitat is biodiversity. And so that's what we're aiming for here, is to maintain Alaska's biodiversity. So they also can just degrade habitat in general, and therefore impact cultural and subsistence practices. Nationally, this number is probably 5 years old or so now, but the invasive species currently are estimated to cost the US $140 billion annually in economic losses. Here in Alaska, some work by Dr. Toby Schwer in 2019 showed that if Alodia, our first aquatic invasive species, was allowed to spread across the state, it could cost the commercial salmon fishery $159 million per year. And then here locally on the Kenai Peninsula, you'll see this photo here is from the Russian River corridor, the power line corridor that runs through there. And HEA has been required to treat the reed canary grass there for the last several years. And they spend about $70,000 a year doing so. So that's pretty expensive. We are focused on early detection and rapid response. So we want to hit invasive plants before they are that expensive to control and eradicate when it's still possible. Invasive plants get here in a variety of ways, mostly wherever humans go, the plants will follow. But what's interesting and the focus of this talk is the vector of humans introducing plants because they like them. They're pretty. So these ornamentals are all ones that have been introduced to Alaska, and they have all jumped the fence or the yard and expanded, some more than others. So white sweet clover down here is a huge problem for us along our highways, whereas butter and eggs and hemp nettle is pretty easily outcompeted by intact forests, but it will thrive in disturbed areas and yards and lawns. Okay, let's talk about chokecherry trees. So there are two species I'll talk about today, and they have several common names. The Mayday tree or European bird cherry tree is the Prunus patis, and that's what you're looking at here in this homestead photo from Homer. And then the chokecherry tree is usually what's referred to as the Prunus virginiana. But more and more in the invasive species community in Alaska, we're just sort of using the chokecherry as a catch-all phrase. But if you hear Mayday, bird cherry, chokecherry, they're all invasive Prunus trees. So they're highly invasive in Alaska, and I'm sure many of you are very aware of this in the crowd. Starting in the 50s and 60s, they were planted, and then 70s and 80s, just the amount of these trees that were planted in communities across Alaska increased exponentially. So Anchorage, Fairbanks, Talkeetna, Hope, and they are so popular because they grow in Alaska. They have these beautiful white flowers that attract the birds. The birds can spread these chokecherries. They're about pea size, up to 5 miles away from the mother tree. So that's part of the problem. And they have a lot of sentimental value to people. They also are some of the first trees to green up in the spring and flower early. And then their leaves stay green well into the late summer after many of our native trees have already started to senesce. So there's no doubt in our mind that these trees are a problem. We have seen them invade riparian areas along streams, outcompete understory native vegetation, so our berries, our forbs, and also hold their own against alders and birch. And then they can create these seedling flushes in the understory. And removing them has been some of the gnarliest work that we have been doing, and including some of our foresters we've worked with. They're kind of tricky to take down because of the way they twist as they grow. Some of the specific problems with them, I already mentioned that they outcompete our native vegetation. So one of the indirect impacts of that is that, you know, our juvenile salmon depend upon a diverse and abundant insect population that depends on alder trees growing along the streams and then falling into the streams. The insects fall into the streams. So when the Prunus patis come in and outcompete those alders, it changes the diversity and abundance of insects. And there have been some studies out of UAF that have shown this. Also, the trees have cyanide in them, all Prunus trees do, and that is toxic to wildlife. Moose have been documented as dying, and cause of death being because they ate these Prunus trees. I've also seen, you know, moose, if they're healthy, they can tolerate a little bit, but if they're already malnourished and it's the, you know, late winter, early spring, they're much more vulnerable to that toxicity. Okay, the two trees that I want to focus on, we have the Prunus patis. So this is European bird cherry or Mayday. This one, the leaves turn yellow in the fall. And then the Prunus virginiana, the leaves turn kind of a red or real dark, deep purple in the fall. And there are several varieties of Prunus virginiana, the Schubert variety, Bailey Select, or Canada Red. All of these have been known to be fertile fertile and spread outside of landscapes. In Homer, there was concern by gardeners and a lot of attachment to, especially the Bailey Select and the Canada Red. And there's been a fungus that has impacted the prunus trees a little bit and stunted some of their seed production and viability. But we did have we sent some of the cherries to the Plant Material Center to test their viability to make sure, and they were able to germinate. So we do know that all of those varieties have the ability to reproduce and produce viable seed. And then I wanted to mention the Prunus mackii, or Amur cherry. This is not considered invasive at this time, and it is most easily distinguished because it has this copper-colored bark. And when we're working with landowners, especially public landowners like city government, they have been quite relieved when they learn they don't need to remove their Prunus mackii, but we do want them to remove their chokecherry or Mayday trees. So that's kind of been a selling point for us. You don't have to remove the pretty copper-colored trees. That being said, I don't recommend that people plant these because it could just be a matter of time before we see them starting to spread as aggressively. But right now, they are not considered as invasive. Oh, and so in 2019, when we first started thinking about launching this project, we knew that prunus trees were a problem in Anchorage, Fairbanks, Talkeetna, and Hope, but we didn't really know what was happening on the Kenai Peninsula beyond Hope. And that's just a little bit of a teaser. We'll come back to our inquiry on the Kenai Peninsula. I want to talk about just some of the management techniques for these prunus trees. Hands down, prevention is the best approach. We need the state of Alaska to update their prohibited and noxious weed list to include Prunus patis and Prunus virginiana. That's something that's been discussed for many years now, but otherwise we're just depending on the goodness of the plant retailers to not buy those trees and sell them, which is tough. So we certainly need some more support on the prevention side. Manual removal, you can cut them down. We'll talk about that in a minute. Mechanical removal would be things like mowing or using a chainsaw, and then chemical control is using herbicide. So manual removal, this can be effective for saplings or small trees. You have to make sure you get the full root system. And when, they're only a foot tall, it's pretty easy to pull them out. And the little tiny saplings that sprout each year, those are really easy to pull out too. But the site needs to be monitored for many years because if you're dealing with that level of infestation, you probably have just a high quantity or density of these trees sprouting. Mechanical removal can be counterproductive. So if you're manually cutting down a tree with a chainsaw and you just leave it, then those branches, the trunks, and the root system are all going to sucker and sprout. And you're just creating more of a jungly headache and mess for yourself later. This photo is from a homestead in Homer where somebody had previously tried 20 years ago to remove their trees. And this is all of the growth that they stimulated. That being said, I have heard that with the little saplings, if you have a lot coming up in your yard, mowing them can be an effective way if you don't have time to hand pull. You just have to make sure you stay on top of it. And then chemical control. So this is really the only effective option for eradicating mature trees. You need the herbicide to kill the root system. It's cost and labor efficient, and we've found ways with a lot of support from Gino Graziano and Tim Stollard to have very low risk of damage to non-target plants. So thankfully, we know that just a 50% glyphosate solution will sufficiently kill a mature chokecherry tree, and it won't have non-target impacts, even if it's surrounded by, elderflower or alders. And I won't get into more of that, but there's a lot more resources on that front. And Gino has done a lot of work on that in recent years. We basically use two styles of treatment: a frill treatment, which is this photo in the upper right, where you hack into the cambium layer and you squirt some herbicide in there, and then the tree pulls it down into its root system. Or the cut stump treatment, which this needs to be done within 15 minutes after cutting down a tree, because the tree will immediately start to produce a protective layer over the stump. So that one requires a little more coordination with whoever's cutting the tree down. So if left unchecked, removal can be extremely difficult or even impossible. And this photo on the bottom is from the Kilcher homestead when they were getting a little creative about how to manage these heavy limbs. But certainly the most time-consuming part, if you are manually removing the tree before you have killed it with herbicide, the limbs are really difficult to manage and move and transport. But they make great firewood. They're good for carving. And the chips can be used for smoking fish too. So we do have some alternative trees here for planting. These Usurian pear, hawthorn, crab apples, and serviceberry. And all of these, I believe I have seen growing in Homer, but other places in Alaska, might not be possible or suitable climate. But certainly, the serviceberry I've seen a lot of in the Anchorage area, and those are native to Alaska. Okay, so let's go back to the Kenai Peninsula. When we first started this project, so 2019, 2020, the public narrative was, well, these prunus trees aren't really a problem here. They don't seem to be spreading. They're wedding gifts, memorial plantings. They have a lot of sentimental value for folks. Beautiful flowers, attract the birds. Everybody loves the Mayday trees. But nobody had actually taken the time to look to see if they were spreading. This was just anecdotal information. So we asked this question: are chokecherry or birdcherry trees a problem on the Kenai Peninsula? We launched a survey program in 2020 with a goal to map most of the peninsula. And we solicited help from the public in reporting known infestations. We launched a pilot cost share program where we offered landowners a $100 reimbursement for alternative plantings if they removed all of their chokecherry trees on their property. And we started to gain a lot of outreach momentum. People started talking, calling us, saying, what, this is an invasive tree, I didn't know that, and we're pretty eager to get rid of it. So the narrative was changing. We didn't want to lose that opportunity and that momentum. So we were able to get more funding through the Alaska Division of Forestry, supported through the U.S. Forest Service, to continue offering landowner removal assistance and just basically strengthen and expand the capacity of the program. So what we did first was focus on training a small team of surveyors on how to identify the prunus trees, and then the best way to map on a peninsula scale and outreach. So we made sure to survey in May and June when the trees are flowering. Otherwise, it's really difficult to identify them, especially from afar, especially when we're, interested in private properties. And we at the time, it was called Art Collector. Now it's called Esri Field Maps. That's the app that we use on our phones or iPads that talks directly to ArcGIS Online. So we were able to create a pretty basic survey template. And then all of those SISMA partners also reported trees in remote areas where you wouldn't expect to find them, on the roadside. So that was very helpful and allowed us to start the permitting process for treating trees in public spaces for the next year. We gave presentations to garden clubs, trail committees, community clubs. We did a radio program. KBBI is the local Homer radio program. And then also we worked with local landowners who have been champions related to invasive species or prunus trees. So in Hope, there are a few. In Homer, several surfaced as, just helping to spread the word in the communities. So here's a snapshot of what our mapping looked like. In the Homer area, we were drawing polygons, and we surveyed by bicycle, car, foot, and canoe. We didn't collect a lot of information, just tried to keep it basic. So surveyor's name, date, species, the ID confidence. So in this case, we're trying to get a sense of the density of trees in a community. So I'm, riding my bike up and down these streets and have my binoculars and looking to see if I can identify from afar a prunus tree. And in a 2-week window, you can get pretty good at identifying these trees because there's nothing else flowering that looks similar to it. But because of that, we, weren't sure about identification confidence. And then later on public lands or vulnerable habitat, we went back and investigated those trees further. And then height, estimated number of trees, if there were a lot of suckers or if they were, a lot of saplings in the infestation, land ownership, and then if we thought it was intentionally planted or not. Some of the outreach tools we used. So here's the radio program that was during COVID, actually. So that worked out really well to utilize the radio. We had a lot of social media posts, and then we posted flyers, physical flyers around town, advertising the $100 replacement program, and just some basic facts about the chokecherry trees. And within 1 week of doing the radio program, I had 15 landowners calling me, asking for support and removal. So what did we find? Well, there are a lot of old homesteads like this in the Homer area specifically that had, mature mother trees that had been growing there for 30 plus years. And basically the understory was almost all prunus saplings. And we found them growing in riparian areas. This is a photo from the Kenai River. There are a few infestations in the Cooper Landing area. And we believe that these trees sprouted from cherries dropped by birds. And this is an example of, in Homer, we have a lot of wet gullies alongside roadways, and we found a lot of prunus growing amongst the alder and the birch. And this is the sort of thing I think nobody had been looking for, so they hadn't noticed. But it takes several years for a tree to reach maturity so that they can start flowering to this degree. So we're gathering our evidence here and starting to shift the narrative that prunus trees actually are a problem on the southern Kenai Peninsula. And we were talking to a lot of landowners who had previously tried to cut down their trees because they were starting to give them headaches in their yard. And then we get this, jungle of sprouting stems. And then the seedling flush, as I mentioned. Again, this was really popular in old homesteads. In general, as we talked with more landowners, they reported exponential growth in the last 5 years, and that the suckers and seedlings had started to become a big pain for them to manage, and neighbors too. So if, somebody's neighbor had 4 trees, they pulled 70 saplings in the spring from their own yard. And what we learned is, so mostly what we ended up doing for landowner support, what we found people wanted is they're willing to cut down their own tree. Many of them weren't even interested in the $100 reimbursement program, but they just wanted help with the herbicide. They didn't know how to kill the root system. They were really relieved if we would just come in and kill the tree with the glyphosate solution. So that's kind of the main incentive. And we have removed a lot of trees at this point. I'll come back to that. Just getting back to the transport and disposal of limbs, it's a problem if you're cutting down these trees and transporting them once they have cherries. And of course, timing of when you receive grant funding and you start getting projects rolling and start working with landowners is always a little slow. So by the time we were actually removing some of these trees, they already had cherries, and we had to be careful as we transported them to the landfill that we weren't spreading the infestation across town. We did work with the landfill to let them know we had invasive trees coming in, and they were happy to accommodate and make sure that they made it in the burn pile. But that was mostly for the limbs that didn't have useful firewood. Most landowners kept the firewood, or my staff were happy to take firewood home too. And I will say that we offered cut stump treatments mostly to landowners in the first year, just because people had trees very close to their homes and they didn't want to kill them standing. And so at this point, we weren't discriminating against the type of tree or infestation. We just were trying to get the message out and offer help of any kind to folks to remove these trees. So even though, some properties ended up being more labor intensive than others, I think it was still worth it because it helped get the word out. Oh, and I will mention, last year, we were able to partner with the Homer Council on the Arts, and they did a spoon carving workshop with some prunus trees that we removed. And that was another great outreach tool. And the artists really enjoyed working with the wood. So some of our outreach impacts that we noticed in that first year in 2020 was that the Alaska Food Hub, which is an online portal basically for selling locally grown food, was contacted by concerned citizens because maydays were being sold as seedlings for people to plant. And the managers of the food hub contacted the seller and strongly encouraged them to stop selling. They didn't have a policy on this, given that the customers were complaining, and they did stop selling it. So that seemed like a huge success. At the Homer Farmers Market, numerous complaints were received again because Mayday trees were being sold at the farmers market. And this prompted the board of the farmers market to consider an invasive species policy and prohibit the sale of invasive plants. I don't think that they have actually finalized that, but it at least got the conversation going. And then we also contacted every plant nursery and retailer that we knew of that was physically on the Kenai Peninsula and asked them to not purchase Prunus patis, at least. And all of them actually, by 2021, agreed to not purchase those. Prunus virginiana, those chokecherry trees, are still being sold by many of them, but we did discourage them and we did give them a heads up that at some point here, they should be prohibited to be sold, depending on when the state of Alaska is able to enforce that regulation. So I kind of already mentioned this. Our goal of landowner assistance was to get the word out and reduce the number of cherries being spread by birds. So we knew we weren't going to eradicate these trees from many properties, but if we could at least prevent cherries from being, produced and spread by the birds, that was a big success. And the type of landowner assistance really varied. So most of our effort went to these large scale old homestead sites where there had been a lot of trees. And that made sense because they were right near vulnerable habitat as well. There are several salmon streams at the head of Ketchimak Bay that are more vulnerable to invasion, and more remote areas where the trees were out competing native vegetation, where we have a lot of moose that depend on habitat in those areas. So it seemed worth it to put our resources there. It's just a great before and after shot. The top photo these were all the prunus trees in front of this house. So once we cut those trees down, you can see the house. Here's the boat that's in the top photo here. So this was a big project, and this was right along East End Road, just a couple miles outside of Homer. So we got a lot of publicity just from people walking on the sidewalk and asking what we were doing. So results to date, over 45 properties across the Kenai Peninsula. So this includes communities of Hope, Cooper Landing, Moose Pass, and Seward. In the Kenai Soldotna area, we didn't actually map those because the density is so high that it didn't seem worth our time. It was better for us to focus on these remote areas, small communities where we think eradication might be possible still. So over 45 properties have participated in the cost share program in one way or another. Approximately 115 invasive prunus trees have been removed in the Homer area. At least 5 landowners are still signed up for this year. And we've had over $10,000 in landowner match, both cash and in kind. So an example of that is the city of Homer has paid us to remove all of the Prunus patis and Prunus virginiana trees on their city properties. So that was a cash match, huge success. Seldovia and Seward, both cities have agreed to remove the prunus trees on their properties. We are using grant funding for removing those. And Cooper Landing, we've assisted the community club and several private landowners from removing in those cities. And Hope, there's been a lot of chokecherry removal in the community of Hope for many years, and that continues. And the Chugach National Forest manages a lot of infestations kind of bordering their lands, and we go down and assist with that annually too. Okay, so is this early detection? If you're not familiar with this invasion curve, I think it's useful to throw it up here. We've got time on the x-axis, the area infested on the y-axis, and then cost over here. So the idea is that the longer an infestation is around, the population exponentially increases, and it just becomes too expensive to eradicate, and then unlikely that eradication can happen. And by the time the public is usually aware that a tree is an invasive species is a problem, it's too late to eradicate. And in general, in the state of Alaska, that's where we're at with the prunus trees. They've been here a long time. People are very clearly seeing the effects, but what I would like to say is that in certain areas, we still have the opportunity to detect these trees early and remove them and protect vulnerable habitat and our natural resources that we value so much. So an example of that, on the Kilcher homestead that's right against McNeil Canyon, they were starting to notice that trees were, starting to grow on the far side of the bluff. And then just down below here, we've got some salmon streams. So by removing these trees now, tracking these trees that are spreading into remote areas and injecting those with herbicide, we're able to actually protect these resources we care about. So I've got some information on the mapping for the whole Kenai Peninsula that we did. On the far left here, the red polygons are the areas where we mapped infestations. And again, the Kenai Soldotna area, we just didn't spend a lot of time in the urban area itself, but we did map kind of the surrounding areas. So we've got Hope, Seward, we've got Cooper Landing here, some near Moose Pass, and then Homer, and then across Ketchimek Bay, Seldovia here. So over 650 observations were recorded, and this is just 2020. We've had more since then. We had, 1 to 30 trees per site. So Nikolaivsk, which is a small community outside of Anchor Point, right down here, they have over 100 trees in just a 5 square block radius. So super high density. We did do an aerial survey, just real low flight visual, looking for flowering trees last spring to see if any of the vulnerable salmon streams in that area had infestations yet. And thankfully we didn't see any, and we were able to see the flowering trees in town quite easily. We were a little concerned they might be confused with the elderflower, which tends to flower about the same time of year, but it actually, for a trained eye, was pretty easy to tell the difference between the elderflower and the prunus. So that was good. It kind of gave us a sigh of relief. Like, we'll keep monitoring. Here's a close-up of the Nikolaivsk area. We'll keep monitoring that area over the years. But for now, it does seem like probably there are smaller saplings that aren't flowering yet that are spreading into surrounding areas, but we continue to do outreach in that community. Okay, and then what we did with that data is overlaid it on top of the lowland wetlands data that has come out of the Ketchimek Bay National Estuary Research Reserve, and that is available on the Borough website. So basically, these are all the blue in this map are wetlands, streams, anywhere that we think is vulnerable to Prunus patis. And then the different colors are the density. So red is high density of trees and yellow is, just one tree on a property. We surveyed just under 2,000 trees, and 86% of those observations, the surveyor was confident that it was either Prunus virginiana or Prunus patis. So we did go out and investigate the suspect trees in the following years. And in some cases, we did notify landowners and do some direct outreach. In general, we weren't doing that. We were focused on public lands. But for some of those landowners who had high density of trees next to vulnerable habitat, we did approach them directly. And then what I also ended up doing, so I took all those Prunus, all that survey data, and I buffered it by 500 feet, just, I kind of pulled this number out of nowhere. We know a bird will transfer a cherry up to 5 miles, but just from what we saw on the ground, 500 feet seemed like a pretty solid bet that there were some saplings or seedlings around, because we were seeing that sort of radial distribution of infestations from some of the large mother trees. So I overlaid that with the anadromous streams spatial data and then public lands. And so we learned, and again, this was 2020, that 640 infestations were within the lowland and wetland streams, 219 infestations were within 500 feet of public lands, and 23 infestations were within 550 feet of managed salmon streams. So a close-up example of this is the Kenai River. This is the Upper Kenai, this is the Cooper Landing area, and this is the Princess Lodge right here, I believe. So they have quite a few of these prunus trees planted here, and the Kenai Watershed Forum, Maura Schumacher there, did a lot of this work, and her crew surveyed the upper river, found these infestations, and then went back and worked with the community club of Cooper Landing to remove a lot of their trees. We're still working with the Princess Lodge to try to get those removed. They seem open to it, but we're just having a hard time getting there. And we were able to remove these trees in 2021 and then go back and check them out last year too. And they are dying, and that's great. So currently what we're doing is working with the city of Seward and Seldovia this year to remove their trees. And a snapshot of survey data from Seward, we found at least 100 trees. 30 of these are on city of Seward property. And my colleague, Jen Chauvet, just gave a presentation to the city council. One tactic we learned that's quite useful is if you get on the city council agenda when there's a controversial issue, you can actually have the audience of almost the whole town. So that worked out accidentally for us. And we now have a lot of private landowners who are interested in some herbicide assistance when we head down there to remove the trees on city property. They do have a couple of parks where they've noticed them spreading, Forest Acres and then 2 lakes. And so we did some work there last year, and we'll go back this year to check on those infestations. And then there are a couple of trees that are on city of Seward property, but they're also leased property. So we have the elementary school, we have the military resort. Those are a lot tougher to get permission to remove. And the military resort, they planted all of these prunus trees right after 9/11 and have a lot of attachment to them. So that was a straight up no at first, but if anybody in the audience knows anybody connected to the military resort, it doesn't hurt to put a bug in their ear. So some lessons learned about the overarching program. Fall is not a good time to remove prunus trees due to the ripe cherries. A lot easier to do it in the spring. Proper disposal of limbs was the most time-consuming and labor-intensive. Chipping limbs works great, but do it early before the cherries. Education on herbicide and offering the cut stump treatment or the frill treatment created the most incentive for landowners to act. The Bailey Select Schubert variety of chokecherry is a favorite on the Southern Peninsula, and it is not sterile, so we still do not recommend planting it. Many landowners who contacted me did not know the Mayday is invasive. And nurseries seem generally concerned and grateful for the heads up that Prunus patis may be listed as a prohibited species in the future, but we still need that to happen. And it's a struggle to reach other retailers like big box stores, Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart. It's hard to find the right person to talk to. So that's something we could use some more support on. In conclusion, bird cherry trees, chokecherry trees are spreading and competing with native vegetation on the Kenai Peninsula and threatening moose and salmon habitat. The last couple of years and this year, we continued to prioritize surveying and removal of trees based on the density of known infestations, proximity to vulnerable habitat, and their location on public lands. And we just continue to offer outreach and herbicide assistance to private landowners. And there's that plug again to please encourage the state of Alaska to update the prohibited and noxious weed list. So a huge thank you to all of my staff at Homer Soil and Water, to Maura Schumacher and her team at the Watershed Forum, Chugach National Forest folks, Dan Miko and Heather Tham originally helped launch this program, and now Peter Frank has been involved in continuing it. And Gino Graziano at Cooperative Extension Service, Tim Stoller to Alien Species Control have been huge resources for us in just thinking through strategy and best control methods. And a big thank you to the Forest Service and also to the State Division of Forestry and to Jim Rankert for helping us just, get what we need to launch this program and continue it. And Fish and Wildlife Service for supporting some of this work as well. And all of our SISMA partners who have reported infestations. And then we've worked with some contractors, especially with some of the tree removal. And then I do have a short video here from the Kenai Watershed Forum. I think maybe I won't show it yet just to see if there are questions. So we have time for questions, but this is a nice little 4-minute video on the synopsis of the work they did on the Upper Kenai. And you can find it on our YouTube channel if you go to our website, which is just kenaiinvasives.org. So with that, I think I'll just stop and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Catherine. Any questions? Thank you, Catherine. Questions? I guess I have one. I work a fair amount with a really affordable multispectral drone. And I was thinking, man, that might be a really good tool if you're mapping and tracking bird cherries. Have you guys explored that?
Yeah, I have a background in remote sensing too, and I have thought a lot about that. And I know that Jim Rankert has had some other conversations, and I think Franklin Decker did a project through the university a while back, a pilot project in the Anchorage area. And I know in Anchorage, they have a lot more flowering crabapple trees that bloom at the same time as the prunus, and it was difficult to distinguish from spectral data which was which. So you have to do some ground truthing there. I think the trickiest thing, we've tried to do drone mapping for other projects for reed canary grass on the Kenai Peninsula, and what we find with the drone is that you can't go very far with it because of the terrain and the vegetation. You know, it's pretty easy to lose sight of it quickly in the areas where we want to know if there are infestations spreading. So that's part of the problem. And then if you're looking at fixed wing too, you know, you have such a small window of time where those trees are going to pop out as different when they're flowering. Or, you know, the other option is in the fall because they do stay greener later, but you also have alders that stay green. So I think this is probably a master's or PhD project to dig into the spectral difference in the leaves of the chokecherry versus the alder. And that's, you know, that's going to change seasonally. You're weather dependent on if you can get up there and fly or not. So it hasn't, that's in the end why we just decided to go up and do a visual look with a pilot for just 4 hours around the village we were concerned about, just to see if we saw anything. But I do think it's something we should keep working on because I think that those remote sensing tools are just going to become more and more important in Alaska, especially.
Thank you. I've got a question from Mitch.
Thank you, Catherine. Question I have is, I know that you've gone all over the Kenai Peninsula, both far and wide, not you personally, but all of your partners. Have you seen any, as it pertains to all of the forest beetle kill removal, any logging? You mentioned the Forest Service. I know a little bit about that outbreak of reed canary grass, but has there been any, what have you seen on spruce bark beetle mitigation and logging sites on the peninsula?
Good question. Yeah. We have not noticed any prunus trees in those areas of spruce bark beetle kill. I know that depending, you know, so each of our federal landowners are monitoring those sites and keeping an eye out for invasive plants. I think there's a bit of a lag right now. I think we might see some of those infestations in the coming years, especially as people go into some of these areas and they bring equipment. Then we've got a vector for introduction of new invasives. And so most of those sites, I would say, you know, we need to monitor for the next 2 to 5 years to see what might show up. In areas like along the Russian River corridor where we have reed canary grass infestations, if you cut down a bunch of spruce trees and there's already reed canary grass in the seed bank or an infestation nearby, we might see a flush of that grass show up. We've certainly seen that after construction projects or just land disturbance. So again, that's something to just keep an eye out for. But right now, you know, we haven't noticed anything, or I haven't had reports of anything specific to those sites.
I had maybe it's a comment, I think in Anchorage, and I can't remember who it was, but I think some folks have had success bringing the Mayday tree, like invasive pamphlets to the big box stores and getting whoever's in charge of ordering plants, and they've been able to stop them from, so like Lowe's and Home Depot and Walmart's not selling Mayday trees in Anchorage. So but someone here can remember who did that and maybe can give you some strategies, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great suggestion. And it also reminds me that the municipality of Anchorage has banned the sale of Prunus patis. So that's a huge step. They actually have some, you know, regulation behind them too. But yeah, thanks for the tip.
Thanks so much, Catherine. This is Jim Renkert. Always enjoy your presentations and all the great work you're doing down there. Couple things down in Seward at the Army resort there. Approximately how many trees are there, or prunus are there? And then could you also talk about any limitations you have for removal with the migratory bird window?
Oh yeah, good points. I think there are about 15 trees on the military resort, and they're all planted right in front of the sidewalk. But they also have another ornamental tree. I think it's a flowering crabapple, maybe, that's right next to their buildings. So it wouldn't be all of the ornamental trees that have to be removed. And then I know the migratory bird window has actually impacted us more with other species. So like the Russian River corridor, the HEA Powerline Pass, where we treat reed canary grass. I know the Watershed Forum's been contracted by HEA to do that. There's a very limited window when we've been able to get in there and mow it. That's what we recommended HEA do. And I think there was maybe a 1 or 2 week window where they could get in and mow it. But we actually have found that that's not super necessary, or the effectiveness of that has been debated a little bit, especially if we're able to get crews in later to clip seed heads. But with the prunus work, it's not such large scale all at once, so we haven't really been impacted by the migratory bird restrictions. And thankfully we don't have big swaths of infestations like that where we're needing like on public lands to go in and remove. That's that early detection piece where I still feel like we're in that window.
Great. Any other questions? It looks like that might be it, unless anyone online has a question. Nope, I think we're good. Well, thank you, Catherine.
Yeah,
Want to show that video?
Oh, sure. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and then I'm going to reshare the video. And I guess just let me know if the sound doesn't come through. Can you hear it?
Nope.
Oh, shoot. Wonder. Here, let me try once more. Still no sound?
You could send the YouTube link.
Oh, good idea. I will put that in the chat here.
That was great. We still have Zoomers. Uh-oh. I see people online. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, we'll take a break. And let's see, be back here at 10 o'clock. Jim Rinker's going to give an overview of the program, Community Forestry.